Subscribe to the channel, comment with your thoughts, and share this video with someone who takes history seriously, because what you're about to hear isn't recycled trivia. This channel exists to preserve the real, uncomfortable ingenuity of wartime survival, and if that matters to you, make sure you're part of this community from the start. World War II wasn't just fought with factory-made rifles and tanks. It was fought with desperation, improvisation, and an intimate understanding of how ordinary objects could be turned into tools of defense or resistance. In the next few minutes, we're diving straight into how soldiers and resistance fighters hacked everyday items into weapons when supply lines collapsed, official gear failed, or capture meant death. This isn't romanticized folklore. These were practical adaptations made by people who needed solutions immediately, often under occupation or behind enemy lines. How glass bottles became fragmentation weapons when grenades were scarce. When standard grenades were unavailable, soldiers and partisans turned to glass bottles, fuel, nails, and basic explosives. By packing bottles with black powder or scavenged explosives and surrounding the charge with metal fragments, they created crude fragmentation devices. The glass itself shattered violently, while added scrap increased lethality. Resistance groups in occupied Europe often used these because bottles were everywhere and easily concealed. The practical takeaway is understanding that fragmentation doesn't require military-grade casing. It requires a brittle container, confined pressure, and material that turns into high-speed debris. Even without explosives, pressure-based devices using chemicals were attempted, though far more dangerous to the maker. How socks and sand became effective melee weapons in close quarters. Soldiers fighting in trenches or urban ruins frequently lacked space to use rifles effectively. A sock filled with sand, gravel or metal became a compact impact weapon capable of incapacitating an opponent silently. This wasn't theoretical. It was used by sentries, commandos and prisoners of war. The effectiveness came from flexibility combined with mass, allowing force to concentrate on impact. The lesson here is understanding physics rather than brute strength. A flexible container holding dense material transfers energy efficiently. For survivalists studying improvised defense, this shows how concealment and control mattered as much as raw power. How shaving razors were embedded into gloves for ambush fighting. Some soldiers, especially in sabotage units, modified gloves by sewing razor blades or sharpened metal into the knuckles or palms. This allowed slashing or disabling strikes while maintaining the appearance of empty hands. It was particularly useful during ambushes or prisoner escapes where weapons couldn't be openly carried. The key principle is weapon integration into clothing, something modern survivalists still study. Concealed tools reduce detection risk and allow rapid response when surprise is the only advantage. So, let's talk about how piano wire and cable were actually used as silent killing tools. Garrots made from piano wire, bicycle cable, or even radio wire were, well, brutally efficient and nearly silent. They required a good deal of strength, the right positioning, and, honestly, quite a bit of precision, which is exactly why training was so important. Special operations units would carry them specifically for sentry removal. Resistance fighters learned quickly that any noise would attract patrols, and, really, silence could mean survival. From a historical perspective, this just goes to show how materials originally designed for tension and vibration could rather easily be translated into weapons. The broader lesson here is about understanding material properties. Strong, thin, flexible materials can have multiple uses well beyond their original purpose. Now, let's consider how field shovels were sharpened into lethal close combat weapons. Entrenching tools were, of course, standard issue, but many soldiers would sharpen their edges until they functioned, quite frankly, like axes. In night raids and trench assaults, these modified shovels turned out to be devastating. They didn't jam, didn't need any ammunition, and could break bone with a single blow. Veterans, time and again, described them as actually more reliable than bayonets when it came to fighting in tight spaces. The survival lesson here is, I think, about recognizing dual-use tools and optimizing them. A tool designed for labor can, with just a bit of modification, become a weapon, if the design allows for it. Moving on, let's look at how flare guns were repurposed as emergency firearms. Flare guns were never really intended for combat, but soldiers would sometimes load them with, well, improvised projectiles like ball bearings or even bits of scrap metal wrapped to fit the barrel. At close range, these makeshift rounds could actually be lethal. Now, this was extremely dangerous and often damaged the weapon, but in last resort scenarios it just gave soldiers a fighting chance. The historical insight here isn't about, replicating recklessness, but about understanding how necessity can push innovation, especially when the alternative is capture or death. So, let's talk about how wire and springs became booby traps in occupied territory. Resistance fighters, they used tripwires made from things like fishing line, telephone wire, or even just thread, and these were connected to explosives or simple mechanical traps. Even when the traps weren't lethal, they were still really effective for slowing down patrols and signalling movement. These weren't just set up randomly either. They were placed very deliberately based on human behavior. Think doorways, paths, and choke points. The underlying principle here is all about strategic thinking over raw materials. Limited resources become surprisingly powerful when you combine them with knowledge of the terrain and the enemy's habits. Now, moving on to how gasoline soap and rags created improved incendiaries. Early Molotov cocktails, for example, were refined through a lot of experimentation. People would add soap flakes or even sugar to gasoline to make the mixture stick, which in turn increased burn time. The rags weren't just any old cloth. They were chosen carefully to ensure consistent ignition. Weapons like these were used against vehicles' bunkers and supply depots. The practical lesson here is that effectiveness came from testing and iteration, not just guesswork. During World War II, soldiers were constantly refining their hacks based on real-world results, not just theory. Let's take a look at how scrap metal armor was fashioned for personal protection. Some soldiers and resistance members actually crafted crude armor from things like vehicle panels, stove plates, or even layered leather. Now, while this wouldn't stop rifle rounds, it could deflect shrapnel and pistol fire. This wasn't about trying to be invincible. It was about making marginal survival gains. The takeaway for modern historians and survivalists is all about understanding risk reduction. Even small improvements in protection can honestly change outcomes in close combat or during bombardment. World War II really forced people to strip warfare down to its fundamentals. Materials, physics, psychology, and adaptability mattered so much more than standardized equipment. These weapon hacks weren't just clever tricks, they were responses to scarcity, occupation, and the constant threat of death. Studying them isn't about glorifying violence, it's about understanding human ingenuity under pressure and preserving lessons that still matter in survival contexts today. If this deep dive gave you some new insight, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, share this video with fellow historians and survivalists, and let us know in the comments which improvised weapon surprised you the most. This channel exists to document what textbooks leave out, and honestly, your support keeps that mission alive.